My friends, good day. The decline of Western countries, with France leading the way, did not happen due to a series of accidents or incompetence. It was rather deliberate choices made by people who knew what they wanted. And at every decision-making crossroads, they chose the option that was the most disastrous for the country, for the people. And to make sure that there is a decline and that it is permanent, irreversible, that's not incompetence. It was done one betrayal at a time. So today we're going to talk about a betrayal, and I'm going to take a chapter from the book, The Great Betrayals. And we're going to talk about the sale or the giveaway of French gold by Sarkozy. So how did we get to this story? The history of currencies and gold goes back to prehistoric times, but we're going to start rather arbitrarily today. Our video. In 1929, the Great Crisis in the United States, which then quickly spread to the rest of the world. The economies will slowly begin to collapse, and during the 1930s, it's a nightmare almost everywhere in the world. The world economy will be saved by the Second World War from 1939 to 1945, which comes just in time to help turn things around a bit through a reset. In any case, in 1929, if we look around the world, there are a lot of currencies that are backed by each other. For example, if we take the British, many countries that are part of the British Empire back their local currency with the pound sterling. The pound itself is backed by gold. The dollar is backed by gold, and a lot of currencies had this connection, this convertibility to gold. So it's not about the gold standard. I don't really like the term gold standard, and I'll tell you very simply why. The real gold standard. It's when you have a gold coin in your hands, you have the metal. When you have a bill and a politician, an official, a state tells you that this bill corresponds to gold that we have in the vault. The standard here isn't gold, it's whatever state officials say, and we know how unreliable that is. They can say one thing today and change their minds tomorrow just because they can. So, there wasn't really a gold standard, but the standard was the word of the state, and we're going to see how fragile that is. So, what's going to happen? Well, a lot of countries start to go off on a printing spree, let's say. Why? Due to the tough situation and need for money, they start printing. Whereas fundamentally, the whole gold-backed system was designed precisely to prevent a politician from calling the treasury. Yes, print billions and deliver them to my office tomorrow. I'm going to spend. That's what we're seeing now, just to fast forward to 2025. Today, in countries like France or the United Kingdom, half of the national gross domestic product is spent by the state. Practically 1 out of every 2 euros generated by the national economy by the work of millions of people is taken by the state, which spends it as it pleases, however it wants. And on top of that, at the end of the year, it still runs a deficit. We go into debt and give up half our income, but it's still not enough. Meanwhile, people are dying in hallways and emergency rooms. That's what it means. On top of that, these core government roles aren't even being fulfilled. You know what I mean? The basics. But originally, it was to avoid this kind of thing in the first place. So back to 1929, actually 1931. Now we're in 1931. And there's a terrible announcement that's going to shake the markets. The United Kingdom suddenly announces the end of the pound sterling's convertibility. A large amount of pound-backed currency collapses. And then France loses a lot of money because a good part of its assets were denominated in pound sterling. So France will lose the bank governor. He's having breakfast, reading the paper. Bam! End of the pound's convertibility? Why? Because as the economic crisis had been raging for 2 years, the British bank had started printing pounds. The more, the better. Then, after a while, they couldn't guarantee them anymore. They knew it, so they had to come clean and make this announcement in the United States. At the time, the gold standard still existed. $1 meant 20. Well, not exactly a dollar. It was more like an ounce of gold. An ounce of gold, well, meant $20.67, about $20, roughly $20, an ounce of gold, that's all. Anyone could go to the bank, give dollars, and receive physical gold. That was the guarantee. So we get to 1933. Roosevelt, of course, since the crisis was still raging, he also had a lot of dollars printed. And after a while, Americans got worried, started going to the bank to set aside gold because they sensed something was wrong. Basically, and so suddenly, abruptly, they closed the banks. That means one morning people wake up and Americans learn that something is going on at the White House. And the banks are closed for a week. No way to deposit, to withdraw, everything is locked. All transactions are locked during a week of lockdown. After that, the banks reopen, but not before an executive order has been issued. I think it's 6,102, something like that. I'm quoting from memory. So, what does the executive order say? It says that Americans are no longer allowed to own gold. It's forbidden. That's it. It's over. We stop converting gold into dollars, bills, gold. That's over. Finished. But in addition, Americans who had already exchanged retroactively, the Americans who had exchanged their bills for gold had to bring the gold bars back to the bank. Otherwise, they were punished with 10 years in prison. And for a very long time, for decades. In reality, Americans had the right to own weapons, but they did not have the right to own gold. They might still have a tooth, ring, or heirloom, but these were rare and punishments were harsh. Gold was prohibited. If you want, well, if we move forward again, we'll go through World War II, 1944. By the war's end, Europeans are broke, devastated on their knees, their countries, families, and refugees all suffering. And so, well, we take them to Bretton Woods and we tell them, listen now, the only way to move forward in this situation is to use the dollar for your economy, and the dollar, wait for it, the dollar. Well, it's backed by gold, don't worry, an ounce of gold is $35. Notice, by the way, that we already have a devaluation here. It's nice. We already have a devaluation of more than 60%. We went from 20%. 20% $35 per ounce. We had a major devaluation, but it's fine. We're resetting and starting fresh. It's not 67%, but we can't calculate it now, as I was saying. Behind Bretton Woods, we find the British Baron John Maynard Keynes. Maynard Keynes. He was the one who suggested to the British back in 1931 to stop the devaluation of the pound. He was the one who was part of a committee, the Macmillan Committee, which took a closer look at the situation. He went to them and said, listen, it's a disaster to keep devaluing, stop the convertibility, otherwise we're doomed. We'll find him again at Bretton Woods as an advisor to the Americans. He's the one behind what we call Keynesian policies. It's essentially another term for state intervention in the economy. Many people believe capitalism doesn't require intervention, but it's actually the opposite. Capitalism does, just like socialism. In fact, they live off the state, live with the state, and always need regulation. So, as I was saying, the Europeans simply have no choice. They sign on to Bretton Woods, which lasts 27 years. What happens is that they give up their gold, pay attention, to get dollars, because they needed dollars to trade. Well, they take the gold that's in their national reserve, right? And they send it to the United States, and the Americans give them bills. Freshly printed from the office, engravings, so they give them these bills and they use them to trade. The thing is, the Americans find themselves in an extremely privileged position. They start printing dollars more and more while still maintaining convertibility, but they keep printing and everyone knows it, starting from the 1960s. Well, the amount of dollars in circulation is much higher than what the Americans actually have, and they keep printing even more and more. That gives them an absolutely tremendous advantage. That is, all the countries in the world, if they want, for example, $100, they have to provide enough work. It doesn't matter if they provide cocoa, oil, bricks, whatever. To get that bill, they had to bring value or gold to obtain it. That's it, except that for the Americans, it was enough just to print it so they could print. Go buy land abroad, buy entire streets, all that, because, well, that's it. For them, it was simple. Just in 1970, we're right in the Nixon era, just 1970. We're going to print in the United States 10% of the dollars circulating in the world. 1970, just that year, 10% of the circulating dollars were created. You can imagine that things started to smell fishy in France. In France, we already have. De Gaulle died in 1970, but by the late 60s, they had recognized the issue and begun bringing their French citizens back. They wanted to save their French people after realizing the problem, so they organized over 100 efforts. About 130 flights by plane, ships, all that to take the Americans at their word, telling them, listen, okay, fine, I give you dollars, you give me gold. Of course, that's the standard. There was no problem while the Americans exchanged. Except that, well, they still felt like they were being cheated because they said, well, the paper we printed yesterday is being brought back to us. He wants the gold. So what happened in the years 1970 and 1971 is that things sped up. That means there are countries, Germany, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and other countries that started to go to the United States and say, yes, we want our gold, here are the dollars. This time, the American Congress becomes very critical. They start calling these countries, get this, profiteers. They're profiteers, aren't they? I mean, here we have a classic case of projections, so here's what's going to happen. In 1971, while de Gaulle had managed to get a lot of French gold out, other countries acted a little too late in the summer, I think around August. Other countries, like the United Kingdom, literally waited until the last minute to start talking. Well, Nixon comes on, appears on television, puts on his serious face. He always does that on bad days, and he says, well, that's it, we're going to suspend convertibility. Technically speaking, it was a default. Yes, the Americans were defaulting on their debt, that's right, because they were issuing dollars as debt. Since when they issued dollars, well, they were issuing them based on a promise of gold. All right, there was still a gold dollar backing, but at some point they issued too many dollars and they defaulted on the gold. If they defaulted on gold, it's like defaulting on the dollar. They were actually defaulting. We can't pay, we don't have the money, sorry. From that moment in 1971, several things will happen. First, the dollar will start to devalue. So, just to give you an idea of the devaluation. At the time, if you followed so far, 1 ounce of gold was $35, 1 ounce of gold was $35. Today, how much is 1 ounce of gold? It's $3,500. I think there's some symbolism there. 1 ounce of gold is $3,500. The dollar's value is 1/100th of what it was. So it now takes 100 times more dollars to buy the same gold as in 1971. The dollar has lost value since 1971. By 99%. It has lost 99% of its value. And of course, since 1971, now that it is no longer backed and the market is free. Americans were once again able to own gold, but, well, they had to buy it on the market like everyone else, and they regained their right to own that currency. So now, if you noticed for a minute, I told you we can evaluate, we can assess the decline in the value of the dollar by looking at the price of an ounce of gold. Compare today's gold price to the dollar, 35 per ounce in 1971, and you'll clearly see our current position. What are the levels? So that's why, for example, the day when the dollar is, the ounce will be $7,000. Well, you know we've lost 99.5% of the value. You know what I mean? It's immediate. You do a mental calculation, so you know. The Americans, starting from 1971, had policies that tended to restrain the price of gold. Because the more they could restrain the price of gold, meaning prevent it from soaring, prevent it from rising, well, the less apparent the damage was. It was just a way to cover up the misery. They knew things were slipping, but for them, it was just about controlling the slide, making it last as long as possible. They used various tricks like selling certificates. Gold is another example of sneaking back in. You might say this certificate is backed by gold, but it's worth the same as the dollar distributed from 44 to 71, which was also gold-backed. At some point, the circulating certificates reached, even now, there are more certificates than there is gold on Earth. Isn't that right? These are techniques they've used, along with other market manipulation techniques and all that. But basically, let's look at it head on. we're going to get to 99. In 1999, the Fed launched an initiative to force European countries to sell their gold and sell it at a ridiculously low price. Why? Because by selling it, if each European country starts emptying its reserves and gradually selling gold on the markets, well, this would keep the price of gold very low, maybe for another decade or more, and then this would help maintain the credibility of the dollar. In 1999, we have Switzerland with the Swiss franc, which was backed by the dollar at 40%. That means that the bank, the Swiss National Bank, had to keep for every, for example, 100 francs it issued, it had to have at least 40 francs in equivalent, in gold. So we are in a partial gold standard, of course, the term gold standard in quotation marks. So I was saying at that time, people started saying, yes, it's a barbaric relic, it's a relic of the past, we need to get rid of the standard. So we stop all that. Of course, there are votes because in Switzerland's democracy, they regularly hold referendums. So the Swiss went to vote. All the parties, both left and right, they all called for voting to end convertibility and to get rid of this barbaric relic. And so there were a few initiatives against it, but they didn't carry any weight. And so the Swiss people voted to end convertibility, to end the gold standard for their currency. At, I believe, 77%. That means it was a landslide vote. We're not talking about just over 50%. Like, I don't know, when I think Quebec voted for its independence and then it failed. Christian people who said we lost, but not by much. No, here we lost, but we lost by a lot, really. The people wanted the end of this barbaric relic, so from that moment on, the alphabetic constitution was changed. The Swiss bank ends up with a big pile of gold, and they don't know what to do with it. Okay, at that moment in 99, there's also something that's going to happen. There was an International Monetary Fund meeting in Washington, and at that meeting, central banks from many countries were present, including France and Switzerland. Alan Greenspan, the head of the Fed at the time, who is still alive. By the way, he's slowly approaching 100 years old. So Greenspan, who was the chairman of the Fed at the time, gathered the Europeans, and he also brought in the Treasury Secretary. He brought in the United States Treasury Secretary. And then they brought them together in a room and told them, you signed an agreement called the Washington Agreement. So what's funny is that the Europeans found themselves like little children at Uncle Sam's place, being forced to sign a paper that even the United States hadn't signed. They have to sign, they have to commit themselves to the United States, but the United States doesn't commit to anything. And they signed, they actually sold, on that very day, they sold their economic sovereignty. As Charles de Gaulle used to say, without economic sovereignty, there is no sovereignty at all. I mean, when you have foreign countries controlling your economy, your energy, all of that, they can even control your food. They can control whether you heat your home in winter or not. They can control everything. They can make you miserable if they want. You see, because you no longer have any sovereignty and all other forms of sovereignty are no longer valid. If you can't even eat, you see what I mean? So, de Gaulle. We would never have signed an agreement, of course, but at that time, we were just starting out. We were really in the early stages. Isn't that why it's called an agreement? By the way, why agreement? Well, since it's an agreement, there's a bit of an extrajudicial aspect to it, actually. It means that there isn't any. It's outside of any legal framework. There is no vote in the countries involved. It doesn't go before the national assemblies. It doesn't need a referendum. There's no way out. It's just a document you sign, commit to, stay quiet, and don't question. That's what happened. They signed what's called the Washington Agreement. So the Washington Agreement, in fact, meant that Switzerland started selling off its gold first. So Switzerland began to sell off the gold from its national bank, like copper, selling it. And this allowed, up until around 2004, to stabilize the dollar-gold exchange rate. So at that point, with very few dollars, you could buy a lot of gold. And year after year, it didn't increase significantly. Okay, so it gave the impression that the dollar was credible. In fact, it was Switzerland that injected its reserves into the market. 2004. Someone else took over since Switzerland ran out of gold. And then we come in with Sarkozy. Sarkozy, for his part, actually gets involved as part of the agreement that was renewed, because this agreement is renewed every 5 years. And then he will pick up the torch, pick up the Swiss torch, and start selling, and he will start selling French gold. In a context where you can feel there's excitement, you can sense that something is not normal, you can feel that a big crisis is brewing, you can feel that the value of the dollar is slipping, you can sense that gold is still gaining value, and that this is not the time to sell. In reality, what's unfolding is the 2008 crisis that was coming, the subprime crisis. And so France continues to sell, and it's also selling off its gold at a discount. And this sell-off will actually go on from 2004 until 2009. And despite everything, despite the 2008 crisis, they didn't stop. They kept selling. And then the Washington Agreement was renewed again in 2009. In reality, the agreement ended on its own. It wasn't renewed in 2019, because at that point, it was clearly over. And that's why those who bought gold in the 2000s, even in the 2010s, didn't make much money with you. Review this channel. I'm showing you a video, but back then I didn't know about those mechanisms. I'm showing you the video where I made the purchase. I had bought, I think, 3 or 4 gold coins, but they didn't move for 5 years. For 5 years, I bought gold and sold it for nearly the same price I paid. It was from 2019, with the end of that Washington Agreement, which was artificially holding down the price of gold, that things took a different turn. You see what I mean? I wanted to tell you about this story. And so, what is literally a betrayal where we sell gold for copper? We signed with Washington without compensation and gained nothing. Why? It's a betrayal because if we had something to gain, we could say, fine. We sign with the Americans, we sell X tons of gold, we exchange. They're supposed to give us something, but the others give nothing. You just sign and stay quiet. And that's truly a betrayal. There are others among the great betrayals that you can find on Amazon. And we'll see each other in the next video. See you very soon.